Time killer in Pinellas County will be put to death. Shelby Nealy was sentenced to the death penalty 3 times earlier this afternoon. This comes after he was found guilty of murdering his wife, her parents, and brother back in 2018. And he covered it all up. Fox 13's Kylie Jones was in the courtroom for his sentencing and brings us the latest.
The defendant, under the laws of the state of Florida, has forfeited his right to live.
He buried her in the backyard. Then he texted her family as her for 11 months, pretending she was still alive. For 11 months, her family received text messages from her phone, photos of her children, updates about her life, reassurances that everything was fine. Her parents texted back. Her brother texted back. They sent holiday messages. They sent birthday wishes. They waited to hear her voice again. She had been dead for 11 months. Buried in the backyard of the home she had shared with her husband. He had sent every single one of those messages himself. When her family finally got suspicious, when they pushed too hard to hear her voice, he drove to their home and killed them too. Shelby John Nealy grew up in Florida. His childhood was not without its shadows. His biological father, Bobby, was violent, a man who held a knife to the throat of Nealy's biological mother, Lisa, and told her he would kill her, chop her up, and dispose of her. The specific, terrifying language of that threat, chop her up, dispose of her, would echo in the details of what Nealy would eventually do to his own family. His biological father died by suicide when Nealy was 17 years old. His stepfather, Paul, who had been in his life since he was 3, described that moment as the event that broke Shelby. He said he had never seen Shelby anything like this, that the boy he had known became someone different in the aftermath of that loss. By the time Nealy encountered the criminal justice system in adulthood, he had periods of homelessness, altercations that left him with what doctors would later describe as traumatic brain injuries and PTSD, and a documented pattern of volatile relationships. He eventually settled in Port Richey, Florida, in Pasco County. He met and married Jamie Nicole Ivancic. Jamie was from a close-knit Florida family, her parents Richard and Laura, her brother Nicholas, her sister Renee. She was 21 years old when she and Nealy had their first child together. They would have 2 children in total, both young, both entirely dependent on the 2 adults who were supposed to be their parents. Their relationship was not peaceful. Police had responded to domestic calls involving Nealy and Jamie on multiple occasions. In at least 2 of those calls, Jamie was Baker-acted, involuntarily committed for a mental health evaluation. In one instance, Nealy told a responding deputy that Jamie had threatened to kill herself and their unborn child. The deputy observed the surface cut on Jamie's belly. In his later confession to police, Nealy would describe the marriage as a dynamic in which he felt controlled. He would say he was just under her control. He would say Jamie had a long-standing history of mental health concerns. He would frame what he eventually did as the culmination of a relationship that had pushed him past a breaking point. In January 2018, that narrative, whatever truth or distortion it contained, ended in a backyard in Port Richey. In January 2018, Shelby Nealy and Jamie Ivancic got into an argument. What began the argument, what escalated it, what the precise sequence of events was, Nealy would provide his own version of those details in the confession he gave to detectives after his eventual arrest. He told the detective that an argument with Jamie turned physical. He said she had mental health issues. He said he was afraid for his children. He said the situation escalated. And then he said the words that would become the title of this case, words spoken in a police interview room with the particular flatness of a man who had had months to rehearse how he would tell this story. Unfortunately, I went too far. I choked her out. Prosecutors did not accept that framing. They said Nealy had strangled and beaten his 21-year-old wife to death. They said what followed was not the panicked response of a man who had snapped. It was the calculated behavior of a man who understood exactly what he had done and immediately began managing the consequences. After Jamie was dead, Shelby Nealy carried her body to the backyard of their Port Richey home. He dug a hole. He buried her. He then went back inside the house. He picked up her phone, and he began to beat her. Jamie Ivancic was 21 years old. She had 2 young children who needed a mother. She had parents and a brother and a sister who loved her. And she had been in the ground in her own backyard, while the man who put her there sent text messages in her name. For 11 months, Shelby Nealy impersonated his dead wife. He sent text messages to her family from her phone. He sent photographs of the children, of ordinary life, of the kind of visual evidence that reassures people who cannot quite reach you that you are still there. He wrote in her voice. He knew her well enough to do it. He said so himself in his confession. I knew her so well, I knew how to act like her. Her parents, Richard and Laura, received those messages. Her brother Nicholas received them. Her sister Renee received them. They texted back. They responded to the photos of the grandchildren with the warmth of grandparents who miss the family they do not see often enough. They sent her birthday messages. They did everything a family does when they are in touch with someone they love. They asked to hear her voice. That was the part Nealy could not replicate. A text message is easy to fabricate. A voice is not. And over the course of those 11 months, the Ivancic family noticed, with growing unease, that they had not heard Jamie's voice in a very long time. They pushed, they asked to call, they suggested video chats. They made the kinds of requests that families make when something feels slightly wrong, but they cannot name what it is. And each time Nealy deflected. Something came up, the timing was bad, she would call soon. She never called because she could not, because she was in the backyard. 11 months is not a brief cover-up. It is not panic followed by 1 or 2 deceptions that eventually collapse. 11 months is a sustained, daily, deliberate campaign of manipulation, typing as a dead woman, responding to her family's love in her name, sending photographs of her children as evidence of a life that no longer existed. It required consistency. It required memory. It required, above all else, the willingness to look at a phone screen every day and know exactly what it contained, and keep going anyway. By November and December of 2018, the pressure from the Ivancic family had reached a level Nealy could no longer manage with text messages alone. They had not heard Jamie's voice in nearly a year. They were not satisfied with excuses. Richard and Laura Ivancic were becoming concerned in the specific, alarmed way that parents become concerned when something they cannot see is telling them something is very wrong. The lie was about to collapse. Shelby Nealy made a decision about what to do when it did. Richard Louis Ivancic was 71 years old. He had raised a family in Florida, Jamie, Nicholas, Renee, and had spent the months since his daughter went quiet, worrying in the way only a parent can worry. The texts reassured him on the surface, but something underneath them had never quite settled. Laura Ann Ivancic was 59 years old. She was the mother. She had watched the text messages arrive and tried to let them be enough. She had tried to trust that her daughter was fine. Nicholas James Ivancic was 25 years old. He was Jamie's brother. He lived with his parents in Tarpon Springs. He was young and present, and part of the daily life of a family that was beginning, with quiet dread, to understand that something was wrong with their sister. In December 2018, Shelby Nealy drove from Port Richey to Tarpon Springs. He had purchased supplies beforehand. Investigators would later find him on Home Depot security footage in the days prior to the murders, buying materials. He knew what he was going to do when he arrived. He killed Richard Ivancic. He killed Laura Ivancic. He killed Nicholas Ivancic. All 3 were beaten to death with a hammer. The same hammer. The specific, close-range physical brutality of it, a hammer, used repeatedly on 3 members of the same family, is among the most difficult facts in this case to absorb. Richard and Laura Ivancic's bodies were rolled up in rugs. Nicholas Ivancic's body was wrapped in a painter's dropcloth. The bodies were left inside the Tarpon Springs home. The family's 3 dogs, Bailey, Bloomer, and Buddy, 3 Bichon Frise mixed breeds, were also killed. After the murders, Shelby Nealy did not flee in panic. He moved through the house deliberately. He took Laura Ivancic's 2013 Kia Sorento and drove north to Ohio. He later told investigators he had intended to return to the Tarpon Springs home to dispose of the bodies. He did not return, because in the days that followed he did other things. He sold jewelry at pawn shops, items taken from the Ivancic home, and he ordered a pizza from Domino's to be delivered to the Tarpon Springs house, the house containing the bodies of 3 people he had just murdered. He ordered a pizza to a house with 3 bodies in it. Whether this was arrogance, dissociation, or some other form of psychological detachment, there is no clean answer. What it tells us clearly and without ambiguity is that the man who beat 3 people to death with a hammer in December 2018 was not someone overwhelmed by what he had done. He was someone managing a problem, someone for whom 4 human lives and 3 dogs were elements of the situation to be controlled, rather than people to be mourned. After not hearing from Richard and Laura Ivanchik for weeks, family members requested a welfare check. Officers went to the Tarpon Springs home on New Year's Day 2019. They knocked. They entered. They found Richard Ivanchik. They found Laura Ivanchik. They found Nicholas Ivanchik. They found Bailey, Bloomer, and Buddy. The investigation that followed moved quickly. Laura Ivanchik's Kia Sorento was traced through plate readers and records to an address in Ohio associated with Shelby Nealy. Law enforcement in Ohio located the vehicle. They arrested Nealy in February 2019. When officers questioned him about the Tarpon Springs murders, Nealy confessed, not just to the 3 murders in Tarpon Springs, he confessed to everything. He told investigators about Jamie. He told them she had been dead for nearly a year. He told them where she was. He drew a map for a Pinellas County detective showing exactly where to find his wife, buried in the backyard of their Port Richey home in Pasco County. The map was hand-drawn, clear, and detailed. The man who had spent 11 months pretending his wife was alive now calmly guided investigators to her grave. Officers went to the Port Richey home. They dug up the backyard. They found Jamie Ivanchik. She had been there for nearly a year. Her children had been living with a father who had buried their mother 30 feet from where they played. She was 21 years old. Her children were toddlers when she died. In his police interview, after confessing to 4 murders and the killing of 3 dogs, Nealy said, "I had to figure out what to do with 3 bodies. Not grief, not horror at what he had done, a logistical problem. What to do with them." He also said, "I know I come across as the evil one, and, quite honestly, I am. I'm a monster." In the rare moments when Shelby Nealy was completely honest, he described himself accurately. The charges against Shelby Nealy were divided between 2 Florida counties because the murders had occurred in 2 different jurisdictions. Jamie's murder in Port Richey fell under Pasco County. The murders of Richard, Laura, and Nicholas in Tarpon Springs fell under Pinellas County. In the Pasco County case, Jamie's murder, Nealy pleaded guilty in December 2023 to a reduced charge of manslaughter with a weapon. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison for that killing. 30 years for strangling his 21-year-old wife, burying her in the backyard, and spending nearly a year pretending she was alive. In the Pinellas County case, the murders of Richard, Laura, and Nicholas, Nealy also pleaded guilty. 3 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of aggravated cruelty to animals, for the deaths of Bailey, Bloomer, and Buddy. His guilty plea in this case did not determine his sentence. It moved the case directly to the penalty phase, a separate proceeding in which a jury would hear evidence and decide whether Shelby Nealy should live or die. He had confessed to everything. He had pleaded guilty to everything. The only question that remained was what the system would do with a man who had killed 4 members of his wife's family and 3 dogs, sustained a year-long impersonation of his dead wife, and then beaten 3 more people to death with a hammer when the lie became unsustainable. The penalty phase of Shelby Nealy's trial began on July 14, 2025. It was a sentencing trial, not a guilt trial. The jury's only task was to decide whether the punishment should be death or life without parole. The prosecution's case was built on the weight of the crimes themselves. They described each of the 3 Tarpon Springs murders in detail. The hammer, the rugs, the painter's drop cloth, the dogs. They played portions of Nealy's police confession in open court. His voice, his words, his specific flat account of what he had done and why. They reminded the jury that Nealy had not stumbled into these murders in a moment of crisis. He had driven from Port Richey to Tarpon Springs with supplies he had bought at Home Depot. He had entered the home. He had killed 3 people. He had wrapped their bodies, and then he had ordered a pizza. The defense presented what mitigating evidence they could find. Nealy's stepfather Paul took the stand. His biological mother Lisa testified tearfully. They talked about the boy they had known before the suicide of his biological father at 17. They talked about the trauma and the homelessness and the brain injuries documented by doctors who had evaluated him. Medical experts testified that Nealy showed signs of PTSD and traumatic brain injury from multiple assaults he had suffered while homeless. The defense argued that these factors, the childhood exposure to his biological father's violence, the loss of that father by suicide, the brain damage from later assaults, had created a propensity for violence that the system had never adequately addressed. Renee Split, the adult daughter and sister of the 3 Tarpon Springs victims, delivered victim impact testimony that stopped the courtroom. She showed a slideshow of family photographs: Richard and Laura in their younger years, Nicholas as a child, the family together in the ordinary moments that families collect without knowing they are collecting them for the last time. She looked at the jury and she told them what had been lost and what could not be recovered, and what no sentence would restore. On July 25, 2025, the jury returned its recommendation: 11-1 in favor of death. 11 jurors, 1 dissenting voice, and a recommendation that would now go to the judge. Between the jury's recommendation in July 2025 and the formal sentencing in April 2026, Nealy's defense attorneys mounted one final effort. At a Spencer hearing in December 2025, they argued against the death penalty recommendation. Doctors testified again about the PTSD and traumatic brain injuries. They argued that his capacity for violence had been shaped by forces outside his control. They asked the judge to override the jury's recommendation and sentence Nealy to life without parole. Prosecutors were unmoved. They played an unreleased portion of Nealy's confession tape in which he described, in his own voice, killing the 3 dogs. They presented the full picture of what Shelby Nealy had done across an entire year, from the January 2018 killing of his wife, through 11 months of impersonation, to the December 2018 murders in Tarpon Springs, to the pizza order, to the pawnshop visits, to the calm, logistical quality of a man's actions who had never, at any point, appeared to believe that consequences would reach him. On April 10, 2026, Judge Joseph Ballone imposed the sentence. He sentenced Shelby John Nealy to death for the murder of Richard Ivancic. He sentenced Shelby John Nealy to death for the murder of Laura Ivancic. He sentenced Shelby John Nealy to death for the murder of Nicholas Ivancic, on top of the 30-year sentence he was already serving for the manslaughter of Jamie. Nealy had no reaction. He stood stone-faced as the judge read each sentence. He showed no emotion as 3 death sentences were handed to him one at a time, for 3 people he had beaten to death with a hammer, after 11 months of pretending their daughter was alive. Judge Ballone, in his remarks, said that Nealy had forfeited his right to live. Before the judge spoke, Jamie's sister, the woman who had adopted the 2 children Nealy and Jamie had together, addressed the court. She said she supported the death penalty not out of revenge, but out of necessity. She said she could not risk Nealy ever having the opportunity to reach out to the children as they grew up. That she could not risk him twisting the truth, manipulating their minds, causing more trauma and confusion. She said the children deserved a chance to heal without their biological father trying to re-enter their lives or rewrite history. She was asking the judge not just for justice for 4 murdered people. She was asking for protection for 2 children who had already lost everything: their mother in a backyard, their grandparents in a hammering, their uncle in a painter's drop cloth, and who deserved at minimum to grow up without the man who caused all of it finding a way back in. The judge gave her what she asked for. The Shelby Nealy case is, at its core, a case about what a person is willing to do to protect a lie. The lie began in January 2018, when Nealy killed his wife and chose, rather than face what he had done, to bury her and continue her life on his behalf. That choice, to dig the hole, to pick up the phone, to type the first message as a dead woman, was the decision that made everything else inevitable. Once the lie existed, it had to be maintained. Once it had to be maintained, it required escalation. And once the escalation reached a family that would not stop asking to hear their daughter's voice, the only resolution Nealy could construct was the one he drove to Tarpon Springs to deliver. This is what prosecutors meant when they described Richard, Laura, and Nicholas Ivancic as cover-up murders. They were not killed in a fit of rage or passion or emotional collapse. They were killed because they were the people most likely to expose the lie. They were killed because Nealy had determined that their existence was a threat to his freedom. They were killed with a hammer he had bought supplies for in advance, on a trip he had planned, in a house he had specifically driven to for this purpose. The pizza order, the pawn shops, the drive to Ohio in a dead woman's car, the calm description of what to do with 3 bodies. These are not the behaviors of someone overwhelmed by guilt. They are the behaviors of someone managing a problem. Someone for whom 4 human lives and 3 dogs were elements of a situation to be controlled, rather than people to be mourned. The defense tried to give the jury a framework for understanding how Shelby Nealy became capable of this. The suicide of his biological father at 17, the exposure to his biological father's violence before that, the brain injuries from homelessness, the PTSD, the volatile marriage. None of those things are irrelevant. None of them are fabricated. They are real elements of a real person's history. But the jury heard all of that. 11 of 12 jurors heard all of that, and 11 of 12 said, death. The 2 children Nealy and Jamie had together are now being raised by Jamie's sister. They were toddlers when their mother was killed and buried in their backyard. By the time Judge Ballone handed down 3 death sentences on April 10, 2026, those children were old enough to have memories. Old enough to understand, in whatever incomplete and painful way children understand things, that their family was gone. Their aunt stood in that courtroom and asked for one thing above everything else: the certainty that the man who destroyed their family would never find his way back to them, that he would not be able, from a prison cell or from anywhere else, to reach through the years and rewrite what happened in a way that served him. Judge Ballone gave her that certainty 3 times. Richard Ivancic was 71 years old. He had a family he loved and a daughter whose voice he had not heard in a year, and a growing fear he could not name that something was very wrong. He died on the floor of his home in Tarpon Springs with a hammer. Laura Ivancic was 59 years old. She was a mother. She received text messages from a phone her daughter was no longer alive to hold. She died in the same house on the same night. Nicholas Ivancic was 25 years old. He was asleep on the couch. He was killed while he slept. Jamie Ivancic was 21 years old. She was buried in a backyard in Port Richey. Her children grew up without her. Her family spent 11 months receiving text messages from the man who put her there. He said he went too far. On April 10, 2026, a judge told him exactly how far. The Shelby Nealy case is not ancient history. The death sentence was handed down weeks ago. The appeals have already begun. The children Jamie left behind are still growing up. The surviving members of the Ivancic family are still rebuilding a life from what was taken from them on New Year's Day in 2019, and in a backyard in Port Richey in 2018. These cases don't end with a sentence. They continue in the lives of the people who have to carry them forward, and they deserve to be told fully, not as a headline, not as a 30-second news clip, but completely. Every victim, every fact, every consequence. That is what Dark Case File True Crime is here for. The cases that are still moving, the ones that happened recently enough that the families are still in them, the ones the news cycle covered for a week and then set down. We pick them up and we do not put them down until the full story has been told. If you are not already part of this community, subscribe to Dark Case File True Crime right now. Hit subscribe, hit the bell. These stories matter. Every case we cover completely. No shortcuts, no sensationalism, just the full story, from the backyard in Port Richey to the courtroom in Clearwater, from the first text message to the last sentence. If this video stayed with you, like it, share it. The more people who see this, the more stories we can tell, and the more we can make sure the names that matter, Jamie, Richard, Laura, Nicholas, are the ones people remember. Like, subscribe, share. Dark Case File True Crime.